Hey, everybody, and welcome to Breaking Story with Young Screenwriters. We are an online resource and community for up and coming screenwriters, and today we are talking about the eternal question: how do you know if your idea is good? Like, how do you know if this is the idea that you want to commit to be your next thing that you want to spend weeks with developing? How do you know? So, I guess to start things off, Adam and Theo, I'm curious, how do you know? Like you're in the brainstorming process, you're trying to decide what to do next. At what point are you like, you know what? Yes, let's commit to this.
Yeah, so I can go. I believe that if you are starting a project and and it keeps coming back to you, like it's an idea that has ideas, right? It's not just wouldn't it be interesting if I wrote a story that was like a science fiction story with this idea, and then like you don't really have any other like sort of expansions beyond that. I think the story ideas that you should write and you should follow through with are the ideas that sort of spin and develop. Like, oh, what would be great is this character in that situation. Oh, and this could be his mother, and this could be what happens to them next. Oh my God, this is an Act 3 idea. Where like if the ideas tend to spin and expand, like, or at the very least, like it doesn't take like glacial energy to just get at that idea stage more ideas and to expand the world and the characters and their dramatic situation, then you should probably try writing it. Not to say that that is easy for everybody or that all ideas feel that way or that you should only pursue ideas that have that kind of ease. But I think that at the idea stage, this should be a fun part, right? Like this should be the fun part of the creative process. And if you have energy from a story concept or idea, I think it is worth exploring and worth getting to the finish line, or at least trying to. Theo, what about you?
For me, I need to have a very specific vibe going in order to know that this is an idea. And generally what that is there is a segment of the emotional journey where, that moment of catharsis, that big like emotional thing, I need that. If I don't have that, then I'm not ready to pursue it. So I need to know like what my emotional arc is and what is that like moment where the emotions are going to happen. That's, if I've got that, then I know.
I remember you also mentioning, Theo, that you like to have the project you're working on and then you have all these other ideas of stuff that you know that's coming next. And we talked about this when we were talking about like writer's block and just staying motivated. It's like, okay, I know I have to finish this because I have that cool idea waiting on the horizon. Is the emotional catharsis that you look for, is that something before you put it on your docket of what's next? Or is that
No, like the idea will always be like a very small snippet at first, and that'll go on the list. It'll be like, oh, dark academia, a librarian, and a professor, whatever. That's the idea, right? But then
Yeah.
then I'll be watching a movie or reading a book and I'll think, oh, then there is a moment, then there's a moment in the emotional journey where she tells him that he's wasted his entire life and whatever the thing is. And once I hit that emotional core and I connect it to like my own personal dramas and bullshit, then that'll go into like priority phase.
That's really helpful. So we have a question that I want to transition to from Zachary. But I guess
But you have to share yours, Alexie.
yeah, that's true. To kind of get there, I have only had a couple times when it felt like the ideas came really, really easy. And I think that that's because I'll get like the concept easy and I'll get to start adding little pieces like world building easy. That's the part that for me is really fun. But I tend to have to really focus on like breaking it and trying to say like, okay, what is the ending of this? Endings for me are always I'm really good at racking up the stakes and doing all that part, but the endings are the hardest part for me, though making it surprising but inevitable. So for me, I know that an idea is ready when it's not just that the ideas are flowing, but when I finally am like, that's a good ending, that's surprising but inevitable. When I know how it's going to end, that's when I'm like, okay, I can commit to this now. I need to know where it's going before I can dedicate a lot of time to digging in. And
Yeah, that
then
makes sense.
this question from Zachary that said, okay, but what do you do when you can't come up with an angle to tackle an idea from that that you're happy with? So I guess kind of thinking of
Watch
an
movies.
example. Yeah.
Watch
Say
movies
you
and
have
read books.
Theo's idea, like, right? Like, say you have Theo's dark academia, librarian, professor as an idea. And you need to try to come up with angles to tackle it from. How would you all go about that process? Like, once you have that kernel, how do you start?
Adam, you go.
Yeah, so I have a lot of opinions on this. It depends on where you're coming from. Like, it depends, what do you have? Like, do you have a character? Do you have just like a notional sort of dramatic situation, right? It was like, okay, a love triangle in dark academia, and it's going to feel like this. That's all like pretty vague, right? Like, it might be hard to feel like, for the type of writer I am, like, that's not necessarily enough for me to be excited. Like, I'm not a vibes writer. I'm like okay, but what's the moment in Act 3? Oh, I see it all, and the emotions are. Oh wait, I can reverse engineer everything backwards. Like, I need to have like very specific situational sort of ideas to be excited. So for me to get there, I think sometimes I think I hear two approaches. One is you have like a personal connection or some like personal angle or story. Like you're like, I've been thinking a lot about my body dysmorphia. I need to find an angle on this, right? Like something that's like a story you have to tell, like even if it's just like, oh, I have to write about my great aunt who was terrible, right? Like, or my relationship with that. Like, you finding like the specific lived in details of your life and trying to put it into that situation. That's a great starting point a lot of times. And that's when people say, write what you know. They say that because there's a lot of energy and detail, and your personal like authority as a writer comes out when you say this stuff. And that's the stuff that's interesting. Mm-hmm. The other way is, I would say, maybe like more outside in rather than inside out, which is like, maybe borrow a structure from something you like borrow a structure from another movie or story. Like, okay, I'm going to take the sort of how Inception did its heist thing. How did they do Act 1? What is this? What is the structure of this movie, and how can I just sort of swap out concepts completely, and then just start there? Because then you're starting with an editable concept. Then maybe you can sort of put in the lived-in sort of ideas and like inner life stuff. Another way is just sort of change the angle. Like, take maybe like a scene or an idea you've seen 1,000 times, maybe like the thing you're not happy with, and just try to like change one or two things about it. Like, oh, I'm going to change this relationship. Okay, instead of best friends, they're brothers. Or instead of being brothers, they're mother-daughter, right? Like, just changing like the angles of like, okay, we've seen this film noir situation a million times, but what if you change the core relationships we make an assumption about? Like, it could be just I'm just listing a bunch of relationship dynamics, but it could be anything. It could be like a place, it could be a setting, it could be a world. Just like change one element that's kind of fundamental to the thing you're talking about. And if it gives energy, maybe that's one way in. If it takes away energy, maybe don't go that direction. But yeah, there's so many ways.
What if of it. What if of it, I think, is really important. And like, where I would go, like, if that was my kernel of an idea, or if that was my little shock of inspiration, like, I would go to my protagonist first and think, okay, what's her damage? What was her childhood like? What are her insecurities? What is she like? Why is she failing in her life? Right. And it's maybe she doesn't want to be a librarian. She wants to be a race car driver. I don't know, something ridiculous. And then I'm going to move in from there, because I feel like I have to be really like locked in to that protagonist character to be able to see the rest of the world, or the rest of the story and how it needs to be. Because if I don't have her, then or whoever, if I don't have that like central point of view, then I'm not going to have anything else. Like, I'm not going to be able to like root anything else to that central spot.
So you kind of go for okay, who is this about, and what's their perspective on this? Like, what's their emotional issue here? Like, what's the emotional through line? That makes sense. I think that You know, I tend to be someone who, like I just said before, I really like world building. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll be the kind of person who says, I want to do something about, you know, like being the size of a bug, like living like a life the size of a bug. And so then I will do tons of reading about like, okay, insects, like what does it look like to be that small? What are the kind of things you would run into? And I would start building out the world, you know, figuring out all the details that I might want to explore, the places I might want to be, looking into like what kind of problems you might run into. And then for me, I figure out the angle when I find the character that I want to be from the perspective of. So like when I was writing the story about lumberjacks in the 1800s, I didn't know what I wanted to do until I read about how important the cook was at the lumberjack camp. And I was like, okay, I want to be, that is cool to me. I like that. Let's see how I can put my own emotional drama in there. You know, how
It
can I
sparked joy
make
for
my,
you.
yeah, no, I loved it. Let's see. And we had Zachary elaborated a little bit for us. Zach said, a lot of my ideas come from hearing about a situation and thinking it sounds interesting, then wondering what would happen if I plugged in characters X, Y, Z into it. But I often want to do stories in a unique way I haven't seen before, but sometimes I can't think of what would be a compelling way to change it.
I think
Yeah,
that's just
so
trial and error.
definitely. But also, I think if you're not like a really experienced writer, don't worry about being unique. Worry about being good. Right. Like if it's unique or not doesn't matter if it's not good. Right. Like it has to be good first. So focus on it being good and then being unique. Right. Like, and also, you know, like if you're telling your personal story and you're really sinking your teeth into like your unique emotional worldview, there will be parts of it that will feel unique to you just by proxy of how you're doing it. And like if you're really like if you're embarrassed to share it, you're probably doing something right
Good.
about your life, you know.
Yeah.
You know, but like focus on being good first, because it doesn't matter
I
if
think
you're
the
just
bear is a
unique.
good example, right? Like the bear is a world where like to that creator, it's a really benign world. That's their world. That's what they live in. There's nothing unique to them about that story. However, to most of us who haven't worked in a French kitchen, it is unique because we are like compelled by the relationships and we're compelled by all of these systems. So it might not feel unique to you at first, but it's going to be unique to other people. And also it's like phenomenally hard to write a story that works. Like a good story that works is really hard. Yeah. So I feel like focusing on writing the good story that works is way more important than trying to do something like, wow, this is like so novel and it's going to blow everybody away. Like that's so much more infinitely harder. Write the good story. And then once you have that down, if there is an opportunity to be like, oh yes, here's something really fresh, do another draft.
Just before we move on, there's a Stephen Sondheim has this saying that's on my wall, which is that content should dictate form and style, right? Don't come in with style and impose it onto the content, because you're just going to create this dissonance in the material, right? Like if you are, Memento's a great example, right? Everybody talks about, well, it was Christopher Nolan's second film and it's so unconventional. It's two stories going backward and forward and he's got amnesia and that's so whatever. But like the idea itself informed the style of that content. Like the content informed the style. This character has amnesia and we are experiencing his sort of delirious state of like what happened to him. Like those questions from a basic audience view, the structure feels natural because of that. It's not just, I'm going to tell Christopher Nolan didn't say, I'm going to tell a story backwards and forwards at the same time. What kind of character would fit? Maybe he did, but like, regardless, it works both ways.
Later
right?
on.
Most of the times people are saying, oh, I want it to be so unique. I want it to be so unique. And then they don't really think that, no, it should be coming out of who this person is. What's going on in life? What's the story? What's the drama?
I think that something that when Theo and you were speaking about, you know, thinking about being unique, a lot of times what is unique, or you can get to a unique place with specificity, right? That's kind of what you're talking about with the bear, is it's like you might be writing about, the example we give a lot is like a high school story. And you might be concerned that it's a lot like other high school stories. Well, don't set it in a random generic high school. Set it in a high school that you know. Set it, for me, set it in a Kentucky high school, one of the worst high schools in the state. Set it in something that you know that is specific to you, in where the emotional current is specific to you. And that's how you get to something unique, even if the idea is relatively broad. Like high school might not be unique. This particular version of high school is very unique. So you can take
guarantee
something.
All of our high schools were incredibly different.
What was your high school, Theo?
It was like Fame. Like I was in a specialty arts program. I danced almost twice a day. I literally wore dance. I wore, that was my class, was dance class, was most of my classes. I was either in drama or dance or vocal the majority of my credits.
So let's answer Chris's question.
Well, Adam, you have to tell us about your high school real quick.
Oh, I went to
Malibu.
2 different high schools. One was Malibu High in California, which is every Friday was a half day. It was 2 blocks from the beach, and all these celebrities' kids went there. It was very, very cool. And then the second half of high school, I was sent to Central Pennsylvania to Hershey High, which was not that.
It wasn't by the beach? Didn't have a lot of celebrities?
We also moved halfway through the year, midwinter. So it was very much like, oh, damn. Not a fan of that. And I learned about suburban America from that experience, and church bombs and that whole culture.
Did you meet the celebrity, the daughter of the Hershey estate?
I didn't. No. I don't think he had kids.
Probably not.
Have kids. He gave money to orphans, and he started this whole thing. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Chris, yes. We didn't forget about you. How do you figure out what direction Hollywood/streaming services are looking for in a genre for their scripts?
They don't know.
We all have opinions, but so there are 2 things. One, audiences don't know what they want until they have it. And Hollywood is constantly in this reactionary position of, oh my God, this movie about vampires just made $100 million. Let's make 5 other movies about vampires. By the time those come out, nobody gives a crap anymore. And so that's as old as time, or at least the 80s and the Hollywood blockbuster. But
also by the time you see the vampire movie, you as a consumer, they already have the 5 movies being lined up.
The moment those vampire movies come out, they buy those, and then you're going to talk to everybody, and they're going to say, actually, we already have a project just like this in development.
So you can't be reactive to like, oh, vampire's a trend, I'll do it right now. The time did get on that trend would have been before it was coming out.
That's right. So I guess that's what Chris is really asking, is how do you know the trend before it comes out?
That's hard. And like, I'm kind of privy to discussions with studios and producers of like what they are looking for, like from an IP side. And a lot of it is not, it's either hyper specific because they're looking for projects for actors or for directors who want something specific, right? They're like, oh, I want a Southern Gothic story with witches, right? Like that's what they're looking for. Or they have a little wish list, and most of it is really vague, and most of it is like, we just want something really great, right? And I think at the end of the day, the best thing that we can do is just write a really good movie. It sounds like simple advice, but
no, it's true. Adam, I want you to show up to rural Pennsylvania with your big Hollywood stuff on, big glasses.
Did you sit in the back of the room, like
with your leather jacket, just like?
No, I was a nerd. Guys, I was not cool. I was not fuckable.
I'm shocked.
Well, you didn't pretend. Like you didn't pretend. You weren't like, oh, I'm from Malibu High. Maybe everyone's gonna think I'm cool.
No, because I was a nerd at Malibu. Actually, I was cooler. I will say.
Thank you, Christina. I feel included.
Just before we lose Chris's point,
yes.
The other thing I'll just say is like, I've heard a lot of the same things for the last 5 years. Sometimes you hear something really specific. Like people have been saying, give me your elevated bespoke horror film from your unique lived experience. That's always going
to be good.
That's
elevated and bespoke are the...
Write that. Yeah. People will always be looking for that because it's cheap. And they're always making them. yeah, there's lots of make your bespoke elevated horror film about family. Family stories are always popular, in some capacity. You know, when Knives Out came out, everybody was saying, "Oh, give us messed up stories about hierarchical family stuff." You know, like it's always all reactionary. So I sorry, I wish we could have a better specific.
I mean, I fell into this like 17 times where I write something, I feel like it's really unique, and we go out with it. Even my manager is like, this is cool, we're gonna do this, and then it turns out that I'm like right before all of them start coming out. So like I wrote something about being in the internet before Wreck-It Ralph Breaks the Internet was announced, but was in development. Like it wasn't yet being shared publicly. So if I could crack this, that would help a lot. But I think that the consensus here is the thing that there's like a bunch of like random open writing assignments where they will say like, this is what I want specifically. I want someone to adapt this book. But for the most part, if you're just breaking in, if you're just writing your spec or something, they want the experience that is specific to you in some way. That's kind of like what the bespoke is. You know, it's something that's a very not limited point of view, but a very concise point of view.
It could launch your brand.
It's their way of saying, give us the thing that everybody likes that we've already had before, but a little different. Bespoke means a little different, right? And it's, you know, that's the thing about genre films is they have to fulfill a certain function, right? Like a horror film can't not be a horror film to the audience without them feeling cheated, right? And there's a certain structure to that, right? There's a certain sort of promise that you have to sort of design into that experience. And that's going to make it like every other horror film at like a structural fundamental level. But what is different about it is kind of like the questions about like, well, what is scary about this concept? What's philosophically frightening about this concept? How is this specific situation with these people frightening, right? Or connected to emotion? Like what is there are 20 million horror films about family, but I've only seen one film like Hereditary, you know?
Yeah.
So it's and when you watch that film, it's such a specific fucked up family, and that's so like you got a sense of it, right? And so really, I know this kind of goes back to Zachary's thing about having a unique sort of approach. I would say don't worry about the unique approach, worry about the unique story and content, right? Because like if you fulfill like the package experience, the genre bespoke horror film that's an evergreen that everybody's always buying, and you fill it with kind of really like, oh, this is a character in a situation I haven't seen in this type of movie before. Oh, that's really messed up. Then you can start to get somewhere. I don't know.
I would
and
say
you gotta have your personal stuff in there. Like you have to, like the reason that Hereditary worked is because Ari Aster put a lot of his weird stuff in it, and that's why it resonates.
It's like, what is so normal to you that it's boring to you? But when you leave your little bubble, people are always kind of intrigued by. And that's where you start to find, I think, the stuff that you should write about. I can answer this question real fast. What college, university do you think is best to study screenwriting? All right.
School of Hard Knocks.
Biased answer is I went to NYU, Tish, and had the time of my freaking life. Absolutely loved it. Had amazing teachers who I am connected with to this day and started young screenwriters with. So NYU is amazing. There's a lot of other amazing ones. I know USC has a good program. UCLA has a good program. They all are expensive. And there are cheaper options to learn. Like we do lessons here. If I just straight up had to rank the universities, I'd say Tish is the best official university. That's my biased opinion. But it really just depends. It's been said to go to Tish if you want to do indie stuff and go to UCLA if you want to do blockbusters.
Or USC.
USC, yeah. But that's
also,
very biased.
Yeah.
You also don't have to.
the reason why you would go is to make connections or get access to equipment that you wouldn't normally. But here's the thing, equipment is now accessible to almost everybody. At least in a way that wasn't true before. And most successful screenwriters now, they don't necessarily, it's really about connections and networking. So like if you think that the bill, if somebody gave you $200,000 to say, hey, go to college for screenwriting, it's free. Yeah, go for it. But if they aren't, then don't do it.
Yeah, it's one of those things like where I was coming from with no one, I was not anywhere near the entertainment industry growing up, had nothing to do with it, didn't know what the deal was. For me, getting to move from Kentucky to New York and getting connected to everyone and networking and having it through my college was invaluable. But there are more ways, and there's getting to be even more ways to network without having to do all that. So I'm happy to talk about, if you want to hop into our Discord, I'd be happy to answer more questions, by the way. Let's get back to our talking about different ideas. How do you know that an idea is dead in the water? What about that? Have you ever started a script and then been like, you know what? This isn't it. I thought it was and it's not.
Yeah.
How did you know?
Yeah, lots of times. I think there are two buckets. One is it wasn't my story to tell, or I wasn't the best person into, like, I could see, like, if I don't feel like, oh, I am the guy to write this.
Yeah.
Then like if with a real emphatic enthusiasm of like, yeah, awesome. No one else can do this better than me. Like if I don't even, now I have ego and, you know, those issues. So maybe not that for everybody, but like, if you don't have like a sense of like real comfort and confidence being like, yeah, I can do this, then maybe not. But, and then the second bucket would just be, it wasn't thought through. Like, it's not a good dramatic situation enough. Like there isn't enough there. Like, okay, this was kind of an idea for a movie, but it's not actually a movie. Or it's not actually a TV show, right?
What
like
do you mean by that?
Or it's not good enough.
It might just not be good enough, like fundamentally, right? Like there might be other stories to tell, but like kind of what I mean is like when people say aren't enough legs to the story, it's kind of like the reverse of what I was describing about earlier. It's like where ideas come and like, oh, they spiral. It's sort of like, you know, it's a situation where like you don't have momentum. It's not easy to think about what would happen to this person in this situation. It's like not, and often the symptoms of this problem are the objective is hard to frame for the character, like a really clear objective of stakes, and or the character, and maybe sort of like, well, the character in this dramatic situation can't be anything but passive because it's just they're reactive to a situation. Like I've written that sort of idea before and got stuck. But what about you guys?
Like for me, it's like sometimes an idea is just, I'm like, okay, you know, I wrote it and it seemed fun and I was kind of excited a while ago when I wrote it. But then sometimes I've hit a point where like, it's just not good enough. I know I'm not going to be able to sell it. It's not going to stand out. There's nothing inherently special about this idea. When I take it from my personal realm and bring it into the realm of all of the other screenwriters, right? There's like, oh, this story was interesting in a small scale place. But when I bring it up here with everyone else who's writing, is it good enough? No, out the window. Alternatively, I've had some stories where I have kind of put them on a shelf for a bit because it's at some point this story will work. I cannot figure it out right now, and I'm not going to hurt myself trying to figure it out. So let's move on to something exciting, because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to hammer an idea into a hole that doesn't fit in. Like that's frustrating. Yeah. It's not fun. Like, and not all writing is easy, but you should be excited about the idea. And if the excitement leaves very quickly and you start to feel like dread, or it's not working, or you can't rearrange things to make you excited again, like that's usually an indication that, okay, I need to take a break and try something different.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. My self-esteem is too low to be able to question, is this any good, and write anything at all. So I think the thing that Adam said about objective is something that John always has told me, and I think really, really rings true, is me, I know that a story isn't working, at least in its current form, when I keep changing what the objective is going to be. Like when I keep being like, well, maybe she's going after the cure for the virus, or like maybe she, that kind of a thing. Like where you keep changing. Like, well, it could just be like the research, or maybe it's the scientist. Then I don't know. When you keep changing what the objective is going to be and it doesn't have an impact on the rest of your story, that's when you know an inherent disconnect is happening. Really nailing one protagonist who desperately needs that specific thing right now, that specific, tangible, important, timely thing right now, is a big part of how I know that a story is even functional, right? Like that's the root of all stories is a protagonist needs that. And if you're able to swap out that without any consequences, then you know something is not firing in your story.
Which is like, I think that also speaks to like having a developmental log line and whether or not it works. Like, when you see a developmental log line and it doesn't have a lot of the necessary things into the story. It's like, oh, a person gets involved with this, and now they're in this city. And it's like, okay, well, that's an unfinished idea. The log line is not working, then the idea as a whole is not finished.
Let's see. This is an interesting comment from Zach. Maybe this would be a good way for us to kind of talk about like how ideas can happen from something loose like this. So Zach says, I hate movies about autism like Rain Man, and something I'd love to do is something about adults on the spectrum, but as a dark comedy. No idea how to tell that story, sadly. I think that a lot of times what I've seen gone wrong with movies that have to deal with someone's mental state or like mental well-being or anything like that is treating it like the character's like that is the character's flaw. Like sometimes people will make a story and they're like, right, my character has anxiety and that's her flaw. It's like that might be an issue she struggles with, but that's not the narrative flaw that you're going to correct in this movie, right?
Like the moralism becomes the anxiety is your problem to overcome, and that's messed up.
Yeah, and that's not what you should do,
which is impossible, right?
Yeah. And so how would you all go about something like this? Like say you wanted to showcase you wanted to have something kind of about a particular issue, challenge.
Well, it's all about the dramatic situation, right? Like, okay, so you have a couple of adults who are on the spectrum, but like, okay, where are they? What happens and what do they do? Those are the questions, right? Like that's when you have answers that uniquely kind of challenge these people. Like what would be a situation that would really push these characters in a way that was like unique and also tells the story you want to tell, right? Because you could do, okay, here's a heist film with people on the spectrum, and then there are problems that are unique to that situation and the promise of those characters. But like that might not be the story you want to tell. You might want to tell a story that's more like emotional or like about a specific person in a specific conflict. But like the answer is, when people are saying, oh, I want to tell a story about X group or X type of person, that's not enough. Like, okay, no. Who is it about?
Yeah.
What happens to them? What do they do about it? And who are they in conflict with? Like so much of being an experienced writer, I should say, rather than a good writer, is just learning what are the important questions that will actually get you somewhere. And like those questions are very audience facing, right? It's very much like a sense of, you imagine an audience is watching something in the first 15 minutes, they're subconsciously asking questions. Who's this about? What's happening? Why does it matter? Why do I care? What's going to happen next? And if they don't have good answers to those questions, they stop watching, right? So you as the writer have to kind of find those answers for you to be interested in writing it in the first place. Who's this about? What happens? Why does it matter? Where do we end up? And it's just kind of like understanding like how do I get questions that sort of spin the wheel and push us places. And I know that's not really specific, but like if you have a group of characters with autism, where are they? What are they doing? What happens to them? And you could have so many different situations. They could be on an island in the Pacific Ocean during World War II. Okay, but like, that's going to be kind of very specific and unlikely, but like coming up with different choices, you might have an answer that's sort of like the where activates everything, or the what happens to them activates everything. And just having specific dramatic answers, like these are the things, every one of those answers, whether it's setting, world, what's happening to them, has to create drama in a way that like creates the story you want to tell. So like just trying stuff. And I don't know, I'm rambling.
I think before we get there though, like if you're like, okay, I want to tell a story thematically about autism, the first question you have to ask yourself is, why do you want to tell that story? Like, what about your life, your experiences, and how you've interacted with this kind of thematic thing matters to you? Because what you're basically saying is, I want to send a message with a story, right? I want to say something with this story. You cannot figure out the story until you figure out actually what you want to say. Like if you're like, oh, like what's your point of view? Like, is your point of view like, oh, because right now you're like, oh, autism exists. Great. That's not the message you're going to put into the story. If your point of view is that, you know, two people on the spectrum can have a healthy relationship, okay, that's a message, or whatever. So going from the really like vague theme and specifying to like what actually interests you about this and why do you want to do it, I think that's really the first step. And then build into everything that Adam said, where it's like, okay, now we're going to go into all of these extra details and actually figure out the story.
It kind of reminds me of when we talk about theme, how we encourage people to phrase it as a thematic question rather than just a statement. So rather than like autism as the theme, you'd want to think about like a thematic question related to that, right? Like what Theo was saying, like how can two people on, like, what does a healthy relationship look like with two people who are on the spectrum, or something like that, where there's multiple different answers that people might have that are all valid answers, but not necessarily the one that your character is going to end up choosing. When you have a question, that's how you avoid sounding preachy too, right? Is when you actually have a question, a thematic question, instead of just a thematic statement, it can help you not make it seem like a propaganda film, you know?
Or like a lecture. Yeah, no one wants
yeah.
to sit through a lecture. It's got to be interesting, and everyone's got to be able to put themselves into the film like we do with any piece of media, right?
And I will say that I feel like there's two schools of thought on this, which is, you know, you could go the approach of saying, like, I want the theme to be related to autism. So like having your thematic question be something specific about autism. There's also a version where it's like, I just want the character to have autism. I don't want that to be a main focus of the story. And I think that a lot of times it can be, you know, you'd have to find the right producer, I guess. People are going to ask questions like, well, why does this character have to be this particular way about anything that you choose for the character? So it's, I don't know. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but
it needs to be critical to the story, I think, is what you're saying. Like, it can't just be like, okay, I'm going to make this character autistic because I want to do that. It's like, okay, but like, why? What does it mean to the story? Why does it have to be this story?
That's at least like what people want right now. And I think that at some point we go through that kind of cycle with different identities, where at first it's like, okay, well, why are they? Like, if this, like, it used to be like, if this character is gay, then it has to be a focus of the story. Now we've gotten to the point in media where characters can just be gay and it's not a part of their character. It's just one of the many aspects of them. And so it's worth kind of thinking about, like, are we at the point where we have to have a reason for this still because it's relatively new in media?
Right.
And if you care.
It depends on when the story takes place too, right? Because like being gay in the 80s has a very specific cultural context that might affect the story, right? Like, and it should, like, every choice you make should always be like, you should always have a reason, you know, even if it's just like, no, that's who this person is because of this would be their lived experience, or like,
that's true,
I'm gay, therefore, you know, I'm bringing this to this character and that's what this story is about, right? Like, you want every choice to like have you don't want to be arbitrary. You want to like be intentional about everything. And I think
That's
people are
true.
arbitrary about just making everybody white all the time, right?
Yeah.
People are arbitrary about all sorts of stuff. They assume things rather than being intentional.
Yes,
Right. Yeah.
that is true. So let's see if we have any more thoughts. Well, this is kind of connected. Another one from Zach. I struggle with how much of the story I want to tell visually versus through a character with a colorful personality, and feel really strongly compelled to do both. Do you have to pick, I guess? Like,
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
Should be the same. Like, ideally, like you want the story. Like, I always think of the Kurt Vonnegut set. I think it's attributed to him. I don't know if he actually came up with it, but like, if you write a sentence, it should either advance the plot or reveal character. Every single sentence you write, right? And so therefore you're always in every single moment thinking of how does this visually reveal the characters in the moment. Like, you should never just be thinking visually and not be thinking of a character. It kind of goes back to the Sondheim thing, which is sort of like, style should come from the content, right? Like, if you're telling a story about this, the stylization of it should come from outside. Now, there are obviously filmmakers and storytellers who do think style first and come at it. Like Wes Anderson is a great example. He has a style,
but they're going to come up with the story that's going to fit that.
That's right.
I have a question for both of you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
As I'm thinking the question, I'm starting to answer it myself, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Are there actually like good and bad ideas, or is it always execution dependent?
I don't like to attribute the words good and bad in general. I was having this thought earlier because at the end of the day, a film is an experience, and some people are going to have a positive experience and some people are going to have a negative experience, and that doesn't make anything good or bad. I think that there are ideas that are compelling and interesting and fascinating, and there are ideas that are not, right? And I don't think that means that they're bad. I just think that, like, okay, if you throw this up on a screen, how many people are going to want to watch it? And if the answer is a handful, then maybe it's okay, but how do we get more people compelled? Because we want people to connect with our films. Like, that's the goal, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, good and bad, those are relative sort of subjective terms, right? And I think that all art is subjective fundamentally, right? There are things that are more compelling than others, probably from like a craft point of view, but all of those judgments we make about, is something interesting, is something good, is it something bad, comes from the context that we live in culturally, the context we live in from like a knowledge of a medium, right? Like, what would be the most compelling film of all time to people in 1912 is not compelling to us now, because there are different assumptions. There's a different literacy with the medium. There's so many factors that play that come into, is something good, is something bad, does something work, does something not work. If you played The Room for somebody in 1912, they would have been so blown away by the style, the fundamental, the how did they get, even just the green screen, like everything about it would have been noteworthy. It would have been kind of weird and discombobulating and strange, and
it's in color.
But like, things that we don't even register as being happening, or being elements that are at play, because they're so of the lexicon, they're so of the language that our brains filter them out. We just focus on the things that aren't good, the things that are weird, that don't feel connected to context, right? But like, the best film of the year this year will feel very different in the future and in the past. And so we all live in these moments, right? And like, films that, like, I remember I watched Frances Ha in theaters when it came out, and I rewatched it a few months ago. And, I feel differently about the movie than I did at the time, because I was at a moment where people dressed like that, they talked like that a little bit more. And like, now that moment has passed, it feels like a period piece. And it is a period piece for a time when I was in my early 20s and the world was a certain way. So like, we can't really worry so much about so much of this, but we can worry about, like, is this compelling in the moment I live in now, right? Like, I think when people think about, I'm going to work on something timeless, impossible. You as an artist, you don't get to make that decision, right? But what you can do is you can work on, does this connect now to me? Does this connect now to the moment I'm in? Is that, like, that's what you can control. You can't control the other stuff. And the more you think about this, the more you really put your best intentionality and craftsmanship and attention, the better it will be. Whether or not somebody else says it's good or not, that's out of your control. But I don't know.
But also, I think, like, there's a bar that is set when you think about these ideas, like what your idea is and if it's going to be good. And it's ask a couple people about it. And if people are like, oh my goodness, I want to know more about this, you're on the right track. If people give you notes on your idea, or they're like kind of lukewarm about it, that's a sign that you should dig a little deeper and figure some more stuff out. Like, when an idea is really captivating, people will go, ooh, that's interesting. They will say that out loud. And if you're not getting that from people, and this is why you should have writers also in your group, you should have a circle of writers. So you can say, what do you think about this idea? They will tell you honestly. And excitement is really what you want.
I think when I'm thinking about ideas, an idea is really like a collection of ingredients, right? That you put together in a particular combination. Like, it might be like snow skier, father-son relationship, 1930s, and you have like these different ingredients that you put together into an idea. And I think sometimes we might have the wrong recipe. Like, you might be mixing snow skier with 1930s and like winning this cup and this, and not all of those ingredients go together. And you need to change up the recipe. But I don't think that in general there is any particular ingredient that you can't make work in some way, if that makes sense. So like, I think that when you have an idea, there is almost always a version of it, like a different recipe using the same core ingredients that would work. Assuming that the ingredient you're dedicated to is not something very, very offensive, which is the only time that I think that maybe you aren't going to find a good idea there. But, you know, you never have bad elements. Like, if whatever your core elements are, there is a way to make that recipe work, usually, if you strip it all back. But sometimes you can get the combination wrong. So that's kind of my thinking. And then let's do this last question from Jim. And then I think that is all we have time for today. But Jim said, how do you add more conflict into your ideas? John would say, make them brothers.
In every scenario.
Raise the stakes, right?
Yeah, raise the stakes.
Yeah, I think that, conflict it's an interesting term because in some ways it's also subjective, right? Like, it's context driving, right? We can change the location and time of a situation, and that might create or diminish conflict. We can change the relationships, might create diminished conflict, and that might change over time, right? Like, making a character gay could, in the 1980s, create a lot more conflict than it would now, right? Mm-hmm. Like, making a choice like that. Like, so like being kind of intentional about like, okay, is this true to the story you want to tell on an emotional level, and making the choices that ratchet it up in a way that keeps it aligned. Because here's the thing, you could add conflict to the point where it's not even the story you want to tell anymore. It's like, okay, well, they're all in space and they could all die at any moment because of oxygen deprivation. Yeah, that's more conflict, but it has nothing to do with a story about coming out in the 80s bicycles. Or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't a really good answer. I just
no,
think
it was.
Okay.
I have a lot of thoughts on this because I deal with this when I do my developmental work with my clients, and a lot of it comes down to like conflict is contrast, and in any scene, every single character in that scene or thereabouts should have a want or something that they are striving for, and those wants should be different, right? So if you have two people in a scene and they want diametrically opposing things, that is going to create conflict every single time. Like if they're on a road trip and one person wants to go to California, one person goes to New York, it's a terrible example, but every single conversation that they talk about the trip, there's going to become conflict because they want opposite things. You know, and I've done exercises like this to the point where it's, you know, okay, let's make a spreadsheet and let's document what everybody's goal in this scene is and how they can be a little bit different from each other or how it can inspire conflict. And like 10 out of 10 times it works.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then like on a bigger scale, it's like you have like the scene version, where you want people to want different things. But then also when you're coming up with your story, you can think about your overall objective for the entire thing. This person wants to win the gold in the ski competition. You ask yourself, who doesn't want that to happen and why? Maybe it's a rival, you know? Maybe it's somebody their brother.
Yeah. Lose.
Yeah, who has the most to lose if they gain this? And that is a way to build an antagonist who is going to create a lot of conflict for your story. Give that antagonist more reasons to not want the protagonist to get what they want, and you'll create a lot of opportunities for yourself down the road. I think that is it for today. So I hope that this was helpful to you all as you think about your own ideas going forward. Do we have any parting thoughts? Number one thing, how do you know if your idea is good?
I'm excited about it.
There you go. What about you, Adam?
I want to write it.
Want to write it?
You can't get out of your head, right? Like it keeps coming back. It's like,
that's
oh
good.
Yeah, it's
infectious.
It's bugging you. If it bugs you.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a unique one that I could say, but I think that's kind of it, right? It's the ideas that kind of haunt you a bit.
Or if it's a demon, you know, a demon that has to come out of you.
That's you know, exercise that idea.
Thanks
All right. Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Adios.